This is episode 41 of the Real World Paleo podcast. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Lehman, a nutritional therapy practitioner and the reverse diabetes coach, which is also the name of my website. I help clients reverse diabetes naturally, lose weight, and improve their health. I see clients by Skype and in person. I am really excited to have Dr. Maya Shetreat-Klein on the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
And I want to introduce you to our listeners. Maya Shetreat-Klein is an MD and a pediatric neurologist, herbalist, urban farmer, naturalist, and author of The Dirt Cure, Growing Healthy Kids with Food Straight from Soil, which is published by Simon & Schuster this year. And it's been translated into 10 languages, which is very cool because we have international listeners. She offers an integrative approach to neurological, behavioral, and cognitive problems, as well as chronic pediatric issues. She is board certified in adult and child neurology, as well as pediatrics. Dr. Maya has a medical degree from Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She completed the University of Arizona's Fellowship in Integrative Medicine and now serves on their faculty. She lectures on children's health, education, and the importance of time in nature, botanical medicine, biodiversity, and the relationship between health and the natural world. Dr. Maya has testified on topics including fracking, safe products for children, and the impact of chemical exposures on children's health. She also founded the Terrain Institute, where she teaches and mentors parents, educators, healers, and healthcare providers about terrain medicine. Dr. Shetreat-Klein practices, teaches, and lives with her family in New York City, where she grows organic fruit and vegetables and keeps 8 chickens on her urban farm. And I love that you're very specific that it was 8. So welcome, Dr. Maya.
Thank you.
So I like to start my interviews by asking guests to tell us a little bit about their personal journey. What led to your interest in integrative medicine?
Well, I think that I was always interested in integrative medicine. I think that's actually what led me to going into medicine to begin with, if you can believe it. I had watched years and years and years ago, Bill Moyers had a special called Healing and the Mind. And he spoke to many of the luminaries of the day about various different approaches to healing. And one of them was about a girl who had lupus and was not tolerating the very strong immunosuppressant medication. So they gave her castor oil every time she got a dose of the medication, and then eventually stopped giving the medication and continued giving her castor oil. And she continued to have the same response as if she was getting the medication. And I thought that was fascinating. I was a teenager, and I thought, wow, that's what I want to do. And they called it psychoneuroimmunology. And I thought, great, that's what I want. And, I ended up, I think I even wrote about it in my medical school essay, but somehow they let me in anyway. And I went on to go to medical school. And, what's very interesting is, medical school is a very intense, all-encompassing kind of experience. Not a lot of room for questioning, I'll tell you that. And I had my 3 children throughout my training in medical school, residency, and fellowship. So I finished, or I was approaching the finish of my training, and I realized, wow, I'm kind of interested in how diet can affect healing. And around that time, my son, my youngest child, started to have severe breathing issues. And they came on pretty suddenly, along with some rashes. And he actually also had, at the same time, what I would call a developmental plateau, where he really stopped gaining new milestones in his speech, and he was falling more. That was the start of a 10-month journey into his own health and sort of going through the process I think a lot of parents go through when they have a sick child, where, I didn't get very many answers from my colleagues, and actually none of them seemed to be terribly concerned because it was just asthma. He was just a little developmentally delayed. It wasn't even so bad. And I felt like I was watching a train wreck taking place, and no one had any sense of urgency or any really good suggestions as to what to do. Ultimately, I ended up doing a lot of the research myself and finally found an allergist who would help us, who found that he was severely allergic to soy. And when we stopped soy, his breathing issues went away within 3 days.
It's just so amazing.
Yeah, it was so dramatic. And, because, first of all, changing his diet had such a dramatic effect on these other symptoms. But not only that, I understood now that what people ate could really affect their brains and affect their development. And I kind of then, launched into the whole research, which at the time was not well known, about the gut immune brain connection. Because I had to understand what was going on and ultimately, applied it in my own practice to my patients.
Mm-hmm. So with your son, as I recall, his language development also plateaued.
Yes. So he had been an early speaker, started to say words at 8 months and was very related. And he did remain related, but even through this whole ordeal, but he really did not gain any new words in that time. And it took that 10 months of really a plateau. Once we stopped the soy, it made a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other changes in his diet that you made?
Excuse me. We did. We started a really nutrient-dense diet for him. And that includes things like lots of egg yolks, plenty of different kinds of fats, lots of vegetables, bone broths, all pastured animal products, and getting him outside a lot, getting him out in nature, in the dirt, and really kind of giving him that grounding as well.
And when you remove soy, I assume you remove its byproducts like soy lecithin, which is ubiquitous.
Yeah, and what we found actually was that soy oil was incredibly allergenic for him and triggered him. And that was really against the accepted knowledge that you can only be allergic to protein because, so a lot of times what allergists will say is, you can only be allergic to a protein. Therefore, you could have something like soybean oil or soy lecithin because it shouldn't trigger an allergy. It's just the fat. We did not find that at all. And because soybean oil is ubiquitous in, let's say, even restaurant food, any kind of processed food, you'll have to always check for soybean oil, which often will be called vegetable oil. That sounds more benign. And in addition to that, anytime you go to a restaurant, almost always, unless it's specifically a farm to table type of place, they will use soybean oil. And we found that every time that he was exposed to that, he would react just as if he was eating, something that had soy protein in it. So yeah, we had to really look at soy in all of its forms. And that ended up kind of taking me into a whole kind of rabbit hole as far as why is soy so ubiquitous in our food supply? What could be wrong with soy that made him so sick? Because obviously soy has been widely eaten in Asia, for a very long time. And, at the time I thought, well, soy is healthy. And I learned a lot about, the Farm Bill. I learned a lot about how we subsidize soy and corn. And I learned about genetically modified foods and Roundup. And, it was a whole education on top of another education to learn about how food policy is part of what's making a lot of people very sick now.
Mm-hmm. So you brought up some good points there. One is the GMO issue, and can you talk a little bit about what you found when you went down that rabbit hole?
Well, I didn't at the time know very much about genetically modified food, and so I really was just out to get information the best information I could find in the scientific literature about, the benefits, the safety, and if there were any concerns. And it was fascinating. There was very little research and certainly on safety, and the research in terms of human health. And the research was very difficult to find. It wasn't easily searchable, as most issues are. If you look in PubMed, in kind of the medical online medical library of all the scientific articles, it took so much digging and doing, and it was very challenging. And I think that was a very apt introduction to learning about genetically modified food and products, because there is a really concerted effort to kind of, I would say, conceal any kind of information about it other than it being beneficial. And I think that is coming, from an industry level. So that was a very interesting experience, just in terms of trying to find the information. And ultimately, what I discovered is there was actually very little information about the impacts of human health of GMOs and animal health. And part of that is because, several administrations ago, when the biotech industry was first being really, I wouldn't say it was being launched, but when it was sort of really doing this GMO push, they were able to get this sweetheart deal with the government to say that genetically modified foods are in the GRAS category, GRAS, which is generally recognized as safe, which was ultimately kind of saying this is no different than other food. So, it's interesting, though, because, of course, it's patented and they can actually sue people who might grow this from, seeds that they got their hands on, because it is a patented product. And they say it is different, but at the same time are trying to say it's not different in terms of, that it's safe, even though very little testing was required and very little testing was done. So it's been a very interesting journey to learn about how that happens. And I talk about this in great depth in The Dirt Cure, because a lot of times the people who are approving the GMOs in our government previously were actually working for companies like Monsanto. And maybe even sometimes they go back after being in the government. And we call this the revolving door between, industry and government, because they're kind of writing the reports on safety, and then in their capacity as a government, agent, approving the reports that they themselves might have written. Right.
Well, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, and we have lots and lots of consultants here. Mm-hmm. And they often work for the government, and then they become consultants. So it often, unfortunately, can be what we call an incestuous relationship.
Right. Well, and obviously, it ends up really disrupting the safety of the individual, potentially, because, we sort of have now the fox guarding the hen house.
Right. And people don't realize, too, that, as you were saying, soy is ubiquitous in its byproducts, and it was probably like corn, it was subsidized by the government as well.
Yeah.
And so there tends to be an oversupply of it, and makes its way into a lot of our food.
Well, and not just our food, but the feed of the animals that we might be eating. So, one of the things that I thought was so interesting is because of these subsidies of corn and soy, it's actually more expensive to grow it than it is for, let's say, a factory feedlot to buy soy and corn as feed for the animals. So, it's not just about eating something genetically modified through our own fruits and vegetables, but also through, eating animals that are being fed these products, which we are subsidizing with our tax dollars.
Mm-hmm. So what the animals eat is very important for our diet.
Absolutely.
And I know since you raise chickens, you're trying to feed them insects and bugs and grass, right? Something like that.
Well, chickens do need some kind of feed in terms of grains. They, they basically add to their diet by free ranging, where they go around and dig and scratch in the dirt. They eat greens, they eat bugs. Sometimes chickens, I haven't seen my chickens do it, but they may have done it without my seeing. They would eat a mouse. I mean, chickens are omnivores, so they'll eat whatever they can kind of, get their beaks onto. And they do get some feed as well. But, obviously in my case, I try to be very careful about giving them an appropriate kind of feed that doesn't contain genetically modified products in it.
Mm-hmm. So what is the harm in having a GMO product?
Well, we have really very little good health information, health safety information about both short and long-term use of genetically modified foods right now. So on the one hand, I would say we need more, because we can't say that that generally recognized as safe is enough of a reassurance to us to say, okay, this is definitely safe for us to eat. That's number one. There's been some very concerning science about potential increased risk of tumors, fertility issues, and other things in the science that has been released. And very often there's a lot of political pressure on the journals that release these articles. So sometimes you'll see them, in one case, they retracted an article and then reinstated the article. And it seemed very clear that it was not due to any kind of problems with the science of the article, but more corporate sponsor pressure, because we have to remember scientific journals also have corporate sponsors, and, whoever is advertising in that journal might pressure them to not publish articles on genetically modified foods and safety. But what we also know for certain is that genetically modified crops so far have mostly been Roundup ready. And that basically means that we can apply more and more and more pesticide or herbicide. Glyphosate is the main active ingredient in Roundup to the crops without killing them, because of course weeds become more and more resistant, and so larger and larger quantities of Roundup have to be used in order to be effective. And this means ultimately that we've been using more and more and more and more of the Roundup on crops in general, simply because this genetically modified Roundup ready actually means using more pesticides rather than fewer. So, and that we know is toxic to our bodies and toxic to, the animals and wildlife and soil organisms. So, even if we didn't have data that was very concerning about GMO crops themselves having potential health and environmental concerns, we know that using Roundup has significant negative impact on health. And so for all of those reasons, I think that we should really be using as much as possible the precautionary principle in terms of GMOs, meaning, until we have better data, simply because we can already see there are significant concerns, we should really be regulating it much, much more tightly than we have been, particularly in the United States.
Yes, because we don't have as tight regulations as certain countries in Europe, for example.
Almost every other country in the world has more regulation about using genetically modified crops or glyphosate, or they've even banned it in some way. And the United States is one of the least regulated around this issue in the world.
Right, and it is scary.
Yeah, it's of great concern, largely because I feel that the science is really being suppressed in many ways. And so, when we say, well, we have to wait for more science, and yet, there's a lot of pressure not to do the research. There's a lot of pressure not to publish the research, and then we say, well, there's no science, so it must be okay. We have to think about, kind of the various financial influences that are coloring this whole situation. And ultimately, I think, again, according to the precautionary principle, it's essentially the idea it's better to be safe than sorry. And I think right now we have a whole generation, particularly of children, who are kind of guinea pigs for research that hasn't been done or published. But we're watching it in real time. And, that is, I think, of great concern to me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. So let's talk a little bit more about the gut microbiome and, why that is so important for our total health. And so can you talk a little bit about the microbiome in our gut?
Yeah. So, this is, I think, one of those elements of the dirt cure, which for me, when I talk about dirt, encompasses germs and microbes, fresh food from healthy soil, and getting outside into nature. So, we always have had this idea, or I don't want to say always, but for quite some time now, we've had an idea that we've operated by that bugs and germs are bad, microbes are dangerous, and that kind of started way back when with the germ theory, that there are these invisible to our naked eye organisms that can kind of jump into our body and cause disease. And at that time, we started pasteurizing milk. We actually, a lot of doctors and scientists said, even fermented foods like yogurt or even sourdough bread were considered to be contaminated and were not good to eat, which of course we now know is the opposite of true. And so there was this long period of time where the idea of bacteria in our bodies was actually, one that inspired terror. Now, of course, many of us are eating fermented foods on purpose and, souring our bread and even taking probiotics where, I always say, imagine if you would have said to your doctor 10 or 15 years ago, I'm taking a pill filled with bacteria every day on purpose. You would have been, God knows what. And here now, we as physicians are prescribing probiotics. So, what we've learned is that we are in a synergistic relationship with not just bacteria. Our microbiome, I think we like to consider, okay, now we've accepted bacteria are okay, but actually our microbiome is much more diverse than that. And even viruses are a part of the microbiome, and yeasts, certain kinds of yeasts are part of the microbiome. And even it's possible we're going to discover on some level that we have certain parasites that live in our body that in obviously not in massive amounts, but in smaller amounts that help regulate our immune systems and help us digest our food and help protect the digestive tract from damage and help actually, as part of digesting our food, produce certain vitamins for us, like vitamin K or B12, where we actually get we get boosts in certain vitamins from these microbes. So as much as 3 to 5 pounds of our body weight should be the organisms that live in our guts, and of course also on our skin and our nasal passageways. We have many microbiomes on our body, and they're all different. They have different, microbial makeup. But what they're there to do is actually, they live in harmony with us if we are doing a good job. And the more diverse they are, the better. So what we've learned is being exposed to very diverse organisms and having a very, very diverse microbiome is what regulates our gut, our immune system, and even our brains.
So how does that work?
Well, probably in many complex ways, but certainly in the most simple ways. We have our immune systems are actually, I think a lot of people like to use sort of war imagery when we're talking about our immune systems. But I think of the immune system as something more like a very social, almost information processing center. So it's not something necessarily that's always, ready to attack in a healthy immune system, but actually more like something, kind of like the really friendly one who's sort of checking everyone out, chatting with people, and getting, so in this case, interacting with the compounds that we eat. So what's broken down and kind of makes its way through our digestive tract. It's sampling, has little cells there that are sampling everything in the contents of the gut, whether it be what we might consider to be a toxic compound, or whether it's a food compound, or whether it's organisms. And the important thing is, because the immune system is so social, it wants to meet and greet many different kinds of organisms and compounds all the time. And when that happens, it stays in good balance. And when it doesn't happen, or then it can actually become very kind of paranoid, I would say, where it might start to actually see things that would otherwise have been benign as enemies, even though they're not enemies. So, milk or casein might start to look like, a dangerous element, even though it really isn't, when you have an immune system that's not being exposed to many different kinds of organisms and compounds all the time. And when that happens, it becomes this kind of, it goes into a high alert system and a high alert state. And that is something which, even though it might start in the gut, in the digestive tract, it will actually these cells release cytokines, which activate immune cells throughout the body and even in the brain. And so that can lead to, overactive immune cells that might not easily snap back into that kind of balanced place. And that can lead to things like eczema or asthma or autoimmune conditions. It can happen in the gut, like Crohn's or colitis. It can happen in other parts of the body, like, lupus, or in the brain. I've seen, seizures in kids who have eaten something they're allergic to. And there's actually a body of literature that explores this that I cite in the Dirt Cure. But ultimately what's happening is the immune system is sort of gone out of balance. It's dysregulated and it's activated where it shouldn't be. And that can drive a lot of disease processes.
Yes. And that really contributes to inflammation, right?
Absolutely. And while I want to always say, inflammation is actually a healthy response to infection, or even, inflammation is part of how in the developing brain we prune neurons and connections that no longer serve. So inflammation has an important role in the body, but when it's unbridled inflammation and it's out of control and it doesn't shut off appropriately, that's when we get into trouble.
Mm-hmm. So you talk about a dramatic increase in food allergies between 1997 and 2011, which suggests that and you suggest that germ theory is a major contributor to this increase. So I was wondering if you could read from your book the passage that on page 64 starts with, "It comes down to this," and then ends with the long graph at the top of page 65.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear. I think germ theory, I wouldn't say is the cause, but definitely is has been a driving factor in the way we treated microorganisms. So, yeah, absolutely, it plays a role. So you were saying, starting where? Sorry.
The second to last graph on page 64, it comes down to this, which is bolded,
Sure.
and then just through the first paragraph on page 65.
Okay. It comes down to this. Our attempts to control the messy complexity of nature have had unintended consequences for children's health. According to germ theory, microorganisms are unequivocally dangerous. The subsequent war we launched against germs, carried out with the best of intentions, has fundamentally changed our children's internal and external terrains. In the meantime, it's becoming clear that exposure to microbes in tremendous variety is pivotal to our children's immediate and lifelong health. It starts at birth or even before. Newborns' guts colonize with bacteria by swallowing vaginal secretions, rife with diverse microbes, as they are pushed through the birth canal. Now, more children than ever before, greater than 30% in the United States, are born by C-section, causing them to miss out on that important bacterial colonization. These babies are at increased risk of allergies, asthma, autoimmune disease, and even cancer. Breastfeeding, too, supports the microbiome and immune system in unique, long-lasting ways. Babies who drink formula are more likely to have increased infections and allergies, among other issues. Antibiotic use in infancy and childhood, and even pregnancy and birth, can contribute to food allergy by creating imbalances of gut microbiome that sensitize the immune system to improperly overreact.
Thank you. So I think that just highlights what we were just talking about. And I have to admit, I never even thought about C-sections before and the impact that that could have on the microbiome.
Right. And what's so interesting is that, when studies have been done looking at comparing the microbiome of babies born vaginally to babies born by C-section, the babies born vaginally have initially the organisms that are found in the vaginal microbiome in their guts to seed their guts, and babies that are born by cesarean section actually have predominantly skin microbes in their microbiome, which is, obviously very different. And certainly there are ways to assuage that issue. One of the ways, obviously, is breastfeeding, because it introduces a whole new set of microorganisms, and it feeds, breast milk itself contains compounds that feed certain organisms that are very protective. But definitely there's something happening in that pivotal moment of birth that changes the commensal organisms of the microbiome, and that may persist in certain ways for long term.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating that the mother can pass her diverse microbiome or microbes to the child that way.
Right, and I think also that we don't focus, and I feel on the one hand a tremendous amount of pressure is put on mothers to be in perfect health and take perfect care of their bodies, while they're carrying babies. And on a certain level, I think it's a little unfair to put that intense kind of pressure on them. But at the same time, I think, it would be a simple addition, let's say, to a regimen to, let's say, eat more fermented foods or to take a probiotic if necessary, in order to really support that microbiome. Because, I can't tell you how many children I see, who may be having real gut dysbiosis where, I always ask about their mother's health, I'll ask the parents about their health, and the moms will say, oh, I had chronic yeast infections, for many, many, many years, long before pregnancy, maybe throughout pregnancy as well. And sometimes, that is really telling you your microbiome is very disrupted, your vaginal microbiome, and probably your gut microbiome. So it's just, it serves as a message and an opportunity to do something to take care of your own body. And this is not just so you have a healthy baby or a healthier baby, but to be healthy yourself and to feel well yourself. Obviously having chronic yeast infections, just as one example, or, tons of, general GI symptoms, bloating and gas or terrible constipation. These are signs that, probably your diet and some other things might need to change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. I've seen lots of improvement with my clients when we change their diet. I wanted to go back to the testing for food allergies. That seemed that gave you important information. Do you recommend that parents get their children, if they're seeing certain symptoms, such as asthma or eczema and so on, should they get their children tested for food allergies?
I think it's worthwhile. I do check it actually in my patients often. I will look at blood levels. And although some allergists will say that looking in the blood is not a good way to accurately identify food allergens, I've found that, I will often have patients who get the skin testing, the skin testing may not show very much. And then we check the blood and we'll see maybe low-level allergies. In fact, not infrequently, I'll have patients come to my office who have had already the blood testing, and they were told by their doctor, this is nothing. You have a 1+ or 2+ or 3+ allergy. That's not very high. You don't need to worry about it. And then these kids, and I'm thinking even of one patient right now in particular who had, 3 or 4 of those kinds of allergies in blood work, who was having asthma, was on multiple medications, wasn't growing well, was having lots of anxiety, and a lot of digestive pain, a lot of digestive symptoms. And when we actually cut those foods that we found were an issue from a doctor who had done this, an allergist who had already done this before they came to see me, all I did was say, let's stop these foods for a little while. Asthma went away. She's now off of her medications completely, and her pulmonologist says her lung function is improving even in the most allergic times of year, from an environmental standpoint, like the spring pollen season. Her lung function was only getting better off of medication. She grew 3 inches. She has no more digestive pain. And this was just stopping, these allergens, which are not necessarily things she'll never be able to eat again, but her body was obviously very reactive. And so it's taking some time to help, first of all, just take those foods out, and then to help kind of get her immune system and her digestive tract into better balance. But her quality of life has improved tremendously from a health standpoint.
So can you share what foods you eliminated?
Well, in her case, she had a lot of issues. She had, we already knew she had a nut allergy, and she wasn't eating nuts for that reason. But she had a dairy allergy. She had wheat, and she had soy. And in her case, I think she may have had a seed allergy. But she'd been eating dairy and gluten and soy, on a pretty regular basis. And once those foods were out, based on this testing, and this is standard testing. It's not, it's not out of network. It's not anything fancy. It's just the stuff that, you can do through your, Quest or LabCorp or your local hospital. That was the testing that she had, and it gave us that information. Now, I do differentiate in my book that, that's an example of someone having true allergy. Sometimes you might not see positive results on the allergy testing, which is looking at the IgE antibody. Some people can have what we call sensitivities, and there are things like, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and there are other kinds of sensitivities. So if you don't see a positive food allergy on that testing, it doesn't automatically mean you're home free. You can also get skin testing that's still looking at the IgE allergy, but you can also sometimes do IgG testing or just do a presumptive elimination of a food that's really ubiquitous in the diet. And I have a list in the book of the high likelihood allergen foods or sensitive foods. And sometimes you can see just as dramatic a response removing a sensitivity, a food that someone is sensitive to, as you can see removing a food that someone is, technically allergic to.
Yeah, that is just such a fascinating point. A client of mine, we just removed nightshades, and tomatoes made a big difference for her in terms of her joint health and some arthritis and so on.
Yeah, it's amazing how everyone is so unique. You can't assume from one person to the other that it's going to be exactly the same. But certainly starting out by just cleaning up the diet, is what I always recommend before even removing foods like dairy or gluten or nightshades or oxalates, or, people will do a lot of research and find all the possible foods that can bother the body, but sometimes they're still eating foods that are processed, so they might still be getting food additives in a lot of different ways, or, eating high fructose corn syrup or getting a lot of sugar in their diet, or not noticing that they're having things like aspartame, or the diet drinks. And I think that's the foundational thing, is just kind of getting some of those food chemicals out of the diet if you're unwell, certainly. And sometimes, in my experience, that can be a dramatic enough response that, you don't have to be cutting out all these other foods that we're talking about in terms of, the dairy, the gluten, and the eggs and so on. Because obviously, it's ideal to be eating, whole foods, grown or produced in the best way possible. But that is certainly the ideal, is to not have to cut out healthy foods.
Right, absolutely. So stage one, go to a whole foods, clean diet. And then if you're still having problems, you can try the elimination diet.
Right.
So what food allergies are associated with learning disorders? Well,
I think that it's not something that I would specifically say, if you have a learning disability, cut out dairy or something like that. I would say if someone, as we were saying before, if there are certain foods that can cause problems for particular people. And while there are some that are commonly the culprit, like I would say, for instance, that in people who are reactive to dairy, you can see in particularly, I'm thinking in children, you can really see dramatic changes in behavior, in learning, in focus, things that you might think are just how that kid is. And you can really see dramatic changes in when removing things like dairy, if that's the particular food that's bothering that child. And dairy commonly is. I had one little boy in my practice who was having a lot of behavioral outbursts and was having a lot of difficulty in school with focus and with learning. And this little boy, he had high functioning autism. And so, he may have already been vulnerable in various ways. And when we removed dairy, because of his story, I heard from his parents and I thought, this sounds really like a dairy story. He'd had a history of eczema. He had croup as a baby. He'd had he'd had a history of ear infections, chronic ear infections. And I said, you know what? Why don't we do 1 month off dairy? And, excuse me. And the parents did. And they said, we have a whole new child. He's doing better in school. The teachers actually asked the parents had they started stimulants because his school performance had improved so tremendously.
That's so ironic.
And then, interestingly, I got a call from them a few months later and they said, oh, things are bad again. And he's still off dairy and we don't know what's going on, but we've lost all the gains we had. And so, we sat down, we spoke, and I said, well, what is he eating now? And they said, well, and they told me, well, this and that, but, he has dairy here, he has dairy there because, around Christmas time, we saw he had a little bit of dairy. It didn't really affect him. And so we saw that he could probably have some, and it's kind of gotten back into his diet in this way and that way. I said, do me a favor, do 1 more month strictly off of dairy. And they stopped dairy for 1 more month. And at the end of that month, or actually it wasn't at the end of that month. It was about a week and a half into that month. They called me and said, he's back. Everything's better. Now we see he's really sensitive.
Mm-hmm. So which goes back to your other point that you were saying. It's not just allergies. It can be sensitivities.
Right.
Do you recommend that parents keep a food journal?
Yes. I definitely recommend keeping a food journal. It doesn't have to take very long. I always say less than 10 minutes at the end of the day and write in what they've had.
Yes, exactly. And then we also talked about antibiotics briefly, and I was wondering if they're just so common in the American medical system, and I was wondering how did those contribute to illnesses, and why would children be affected more negatively than adults?
Well, antibiotics obviously have been life-saving, and I think, play an important role in terms of health. But I think of them as more like a last resort kind of treatment rather than, what you would ask for at the get-go of an illness, because we're now seeing data. We know that antibiotics do disrupt the gut microbiome, but we're now seeing data that 1 course of antibiotics can disrupt the gut microbiome for up to 1 year.
That's astounding.
It's really dramatic, and it can affect, we don't know how well the gut microbiome really fully recovers from that kind of disruption, especially if you consider that, there are many kids who might be getting 2, 3, 4 rounds of antibiotics a year, between sinus infection, maybe they have a couple of strep infections, maybe they have an ear infection, who knows what. So, we're really not, I think, doing a good job of thinking of the long-term consequences of doling out a lot of antibiotics. And I think that this is a problem both from the standpoint of doctors maybe prescribing more than they need to, but also on the other side, I think that patients, whether, children or, parents or adult patients for themselves, are really kind of coming in and expecting that doctors are going to give them a pill for their ill. And I know a lot of doctors who are very frustrated by that as well. So I think, we really need to start to think of antibiotics as being a very powerful medication on the one hand, and something that we don't want to put in our bodies unless absolutely necessary. And certainly we want to be careful with children because they're in this really important period of rapid development, and they really actually need they need a lot of feeding of that microbiome because their immune system is developing, their brain is developing, and all of that is very contingent upon having a healthy gut microbiome.
Right. And the antibiotics, especially if you're not taking probiotics through your diet or even supplements, can get out of balance, right?
Absolutely. And I would say, you know, much as I'm a fan of, you know, getting these kind of microbially diverse foods into our body or probiotics if needed, you know, we certainly, you know, our gut flora are extremely, it's a universe of organisms. It's extremely diverse, and it's difficult to replenish the flora and the kind of makeup that they exist inside of our bodies by taking a pill. So that's just, I think, important food for thought. That of course we do want to try our best to support the gut using, you know, probiotics, and there's definitely data that says that, you know, it's important and helpful to do that. But at the same time, I don't think we should think, oh, you know, if I take, as long as I take probiotics, it's no big deal to take antibiotics. It still changes the microbiome. Again, it shouldn't scare people away from taking antibiotics when they're absolutely needed, but there are a lot of ways using food and using botanicals to really support the immune system, powerfully support the immune system, I would say, and avoid the need for antibiotics altogether.
So we were talking about antibiotics, and I was wondering also, there are over-the-counter medications that contain acetaminophen and ibuprofen. Why should people be concerned about that?
Well, we've actually started to see that these medications as well, you know, which are common medications used for fevers in children, can actually cause their own problems and have an increased potential risk, even for example, with acetaminophen, which is the ingredient in Tylenol, that it may increase the risk of developing asthma, you know, later in life in these children. So that's a real concern. That especially given, you know, the morbidity and mortality associated with asthma. So this is a real issue that we have to be, I think, very careful with. In addition, also ibuprofen has, what I didn't mention is that one of the most well-known side effects of Tylenol is actually liver failure or liver damage, and this is because of there's a very powerful antioxidant that we make in our own bodies called glutathione, and Tylenol actually or acetaminophen actually can bind that, and it can actually irreversibly bind it, which is part of what can cause the liver damage. So the flip side of this, because obviously people feel very concerned about fever, is that it's not necessarily a problem to have a fever, particularly in children when their immune systems are learning all the time. So, you know, one of the things that I always like patients to know is that the American Academy of Pediatrics says that a fever is not dangerous in and of itself until it's over 104. So most people think any fever needs to be treated. Not the case. And, obviously there are cases where a fever is of concern. So if you have a newborn baby and they have a fever, you need to see the doctor immediately. If you if you have an immunosuppressed child, a fever can be very dangerous. You need to, the cause of the fever can be very dangerous. It can indicate there's a significant infection. And obviously if you have a child who's looking very toxic, you want to get them to the doctor and make sure that the fever is not being caused by something dangerous. But in most cases, for children, fevers are not dangerous in and of themselves, and they, are part of the immune system's own natural antibiotic response. And when you give these medications to reduce the fever, you may make the person more comfortable, but it's not really solving any of the problems with the infection itself. Because the fever is actually playing a really important role in helping the body to fight those infections. So I recommend avoiding Tylenol and ibuprofen except when absolutely needed. And I use other things to bring fevers down that help improve sweating, that, bring about sweating. And that might be something like yarrow or elderflower. These help the child to start to sweat, which brings the temperature down naturally. Even though it may not go back to normal, the temperature is still, as I said, there for important immune reasons.
That is so interesting that sweating can help reduce the fever naturally, which is really also a form of detox, right?
Yes.
So I know you also mention inoculations in the book, and there are certain adjuvants such as thimerosal and aluminum in shots. So what's the relationship between, the immune boosting action of shots and these adjuvants and the introduction of foods?
Well, what we're seeing is this, real explosion in food allergies, and obviously, we've also seen the number of inoculations increase over this same period of time. And, I went into the scientific literature because, I wanted to see if anyone had really investigated how the adjuvants might be stimulating the immune response. Their job, these adjuvants, are actually to stimulate the immune response, because we want to amplify a very strong immune reaction when you give this kind of deactivated or slightly deactivated virus, so that the immune system will remember it and fight it, down the road. So what I actually found was that adjuvants sensitize some children's immune systems to other exposures. And given the fact that we introduce so many new foods throughout the period of infancy and childhood, when we're also giving a lot of these inoculations, it can actually amplify the response, not just to the things we want to amplify the response against, but it can also really trigger an immune response against foods, as well as, environmental potential allergens like pollens and other things. So I really, I have concern about introducing new foods in close proximity to the inoculations. And, there may be some intelligence to looking at our schedule, given the fact that there is this association, and given the massive increase in food allergies that we've seen, including, fatal kinds of food allergies to things like peanuts, which has really exploded over the past decade.
Right, and that the fatal allergies would be anaphylactic shock, things like that.
Yes, exactly. So, we obviously see, that there's a reduction in the incidence of infections related to vaccines. On the other side, we want to look at what kind of health costs might there be, and are there any morbidities or mortalities that come along with let's say the contents of these inoculations, and how that might be causing, morbidity and mortality as well.
Yes. I would hope there are going to be more studies on that. So to circle back to the title of your book, The Dirt Cure, how can dirt be beneficial to children's immune systems?
So, we've talked about organisms and being exposed to diverse microbes, how that's really important for the immune system, and not just for the gut and the immune system, but even for the brain. And it can having diverse organisms can exposure to diverse organisms can help with things like focus, attention, and even reduce anxiety. Can change the way the brain responds to inflammatory triggers. So exposure to organisms is very big, important element. Eating fresh food from healthy soil, which means, unprocessed, as fresh as possible, and coming best, and ideally, grown in places where the producers see themselves as custodians of the soil, because that is where, the food that we eat gets a lot of its nutrition, whether it be plants, whether it be animals, and certainly, sunshine and water, and obviously the nutrients of soil and the microbes of soil. And then, of course, the last part is getting outside into nature, and that's a very critical component as well. So, children are spending a lot of time, and really not just children. I think we have to admit we're all spending a lot of time in front of screens, and inside, and there are many reasons for it. But ultimately, being out, we're designed to be in relationship and in contact with the natural world in an ongoing way. And that means being out in the sun. It means, to some degree at least, it means getting out in, the forest, or, playing outdoors, or just even sitting out on the ground, or, taking walks or hikes. And what we found in the scientific data is that there's actually a very measurable improvement in everything from focus and attention, learning, sleep, mood, even boosts in the immune system from spending time in the forest. So higher levels of natural killer cells, and even spikes in anti-cancer proteins. So our bodies fight cancer more effectively when we spend time outdoors in nature. And so that is, a really important and critical component of how dirt, in a sense, really, really helps us to have balanced health and well-being.
So did you find that there was a certain amount of time that children need to be outdoors to gain these benefits?
Well, interestingly, it probably varies. I think some time is certainly better than no time. But, one study actually looked at how natural light helps children to have better vision for life. So in this study, and it was actually, I think, found in a sense by accident, they were looking at a lot of different factors and kind of had to back into this idea, the factor that seemed to make the biggest difference was children actually being outdoors, exposed to natural light. And what they recommend in this study is 3 hours a day of time outdoors, in order to help vision. So that is, if we think about how much time many kids spend outdoors, it ain't close to 3 hours. And so we really need to, I think, be working with the educational system, and really increasing the amount of time children spend outdoors every day, because, there's, of course, a lot of learning that can happen outdoors, not to mention all these other benefits that are health benefits, because children spend most of their day, in school.
Right. Yes, I'm all for that and grateful that I grew up in a time where we rode bikes and skateboarded and did a lot of things outside after school and on the weekends.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most parents of children now, spent a lot of time outside. I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have any phone. I used to get on my bike and I would be gone for hours. And I knew when it started to get dark out, I'd be at a friend's house. I'd go play by the creek near my house. I would explore the neighborhood. I might go to like the little, there was a little convenience store nearby. I would sort of keep myself busy all day and then come home after being outdoors all day long. And I don't think there are many kids who have that these days.
Yes, yes. Well, hopefully they can get back to at least some of that.
Yes.
So I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today. And listeners, you can learn more about Dr. Shetreat-Klein, her practice, the Terrain Institute, and her wonderful book, The Dirt Cure, on the website, thedirtcure.com. Her book is also available on Amazon, and I'll provide links in the show notes. For the next episode, I will be interviewing nutritional therapy practitioner Jody Cohen about her son's diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and how she made dietary and other lifestyle changes to improve his condition. So thanks, everyone, and have a great, healthy week.